In July 2026, South Africa's Treasury signed a loan agreement for 26.5 billion rand. 2 weeks earlier, its own tax authority had quietly announced something almost nobody outside financial circles noticed. SARS had collected 2.010 trillion rand in net revenue for the 2025-26 financial year, crossing 2 trillion rand in net collections for the first time in the country's history. SARS. Read those numbers again. 2.010 trillion rand collected. 26.5 billion rand borrowed. The borrowed amount is 1% of what was collected. 1%. So why does a government sitting on a record tax haul still walk into the World Bank's offices in Washington and sign for a loan? That question is not really about South Africa. It is about how every modern government actually works. And once you understand the mechanism, you will never read a "government borrows billions" headline the same way again. Why this matters now? South Africa is not broke. That is the first thing to get straight. This was the largest tax collection in South African history, 155 billion rand more than the year before, growing 8.4% year on year. That is not the profile of a country in crisis. And yet, in the same 12 months, Treasury also took loans from the New Development Bank, the African Development Bank, and now the World Bank. Together, these loans allow Treasury to meet its 2026-27 foreign currency borrowing requirement of $3.2 billion. The South African. A record-breaking tax year, a borrowing spree, at the same time. This is the part that feels contradictory. It isn't. It just requires you to stop thinking of a national budget like a household bank account. How the system actually works. Here is the mechanism, stripped down. A government does not spend the money it collects.
It spends against a budget set months in advance, covering things that will not exist for years. Roads, power stations, rail lines. That gap between "we have the cash today" and "the project needs funding for the next decade" is where borrowing lives. The 2.010 trillion rand SARS collected does not sit in a vault waiting to be spent on infrastructure. Most of it is already spoken for before it even arrives. Individual income tax alone brought in 794 billion rand. VAT brought in 500 billion rand. Company tax and customs added another 700 billion rands combined. That river of cash flows almost entirely into salaries, grants, healthcare, and one line item that quietly eats more of it every year: interest. SA News. Government debt increased from under 25% of GDP in 2008 to 77% of GDP by 2024-25. Debt service costs over the same period climbed from 9 cents of every rand of tax revenue to 21 cents. The South African. Sit with that. 21 cents of every rand SARS collects this year does not build anything. It does not hire a nurse or fix a pothole. It pays interest on debt that was raised years ago. The 2.010 trillion is not a war chest. A fifth of it is already gone before Treasury even opens a spreadsheet. The uncomfortable math. So here is the mechanism behind the headline. The World Bank loan is not a sign of desperation. It is closer to a discount coupon. The loan comes with 16 years to pay it back and better terms than South Africa would get borrowing the same amount on the open market. Governments routinely have a choice between raising money from international bond markets at a higher interest rate or borrowing from development banks at a lower one with longer grace periods. A rational Treasury official, sitting on a record tax year or not, takes the cheaper money when it is offered, especially when that cheaper money is earmarked for something specific. Daily Maverick. This particular loan will fund Eskom's grid upgrades and Transnet's freight capacity, the two choke points most responsible for South Africa's growth being throttled for the better part of a decade.
The World Bank projects the reforms could support nearly 600,000 jobs by 2032, with roughly 280,000 of those in the next year alone. MoneyWeb, Financial Africa. The irony is almost too clean. The same country breaking its own tax collection record is borrowing money specifically because its power grid and rail network are too broken to let that tax base grow any further. Hype versus reality. Here is where the story gets less comfortable, because both sides oversell it. The government's framing treats the 2 trillion rand as proof of fiscal strength, and it partly is. SARS Commissioner Edward Kieswetter noted that of the 25.1 trillion rand collected since 1997, 11.5 trillion came in just the last 7 years. That is genuine institutional improvement, not luck. SARS. Critics on the other side treat the loan as evidence of collapse, or worse,
foreign control. One trade union coalition has publicly rejected the loan outright, calling it a Trojan horse for privatization, dressed up as development financing. That framing overstates it. Concessional loans of this size, tied to specific infrastructure projects with a 16-year runway, are not the mechanism by which a country loses its sovereignty. The reality sits in the boring middle. This is neither triumph nor trap. It is a government using the cheapest available capital to fix the 2 industrial bottlenecks strangling its own tax base, while a fifth of every rand it already collects disappears into interest payments made years ago. Widen the lens, and the pattern is not unique to South Africa. Every country with a functioning tax system also carries debt, because the two systems are not competitors. They are timing tools. Tax collection funds today, borrowing funds decades from now, when the interest rate is worth it. South Africa's own financing needs are actually projected to fall from $563.4 billion in 2025-26 to $380 billion in 2026-27, with debt as a share of GDP expected to peak this fiscal year before beginning